So I don't need to tell you guys what the topic of this webinar is. You signed up knowing exactly what it was. And as I was just talking about, uh, there seems to be a lot of excitement around this topic, and understandably so. NLP is one of those things it's a bit of a buzzword in the world of digital marketing, in the world of customer support, in business in general. And there's a lot of excitement to incorporate AI into people's daily operations. So after today's webinar, hopefully you will have a sense of how you can implement basic NLP technology from Google's Dialogflow, which is actually a pretty, I use the word basic, but it's actually a pretty advanced, it's a pretty advanced software that we've used a couple of times for our clients. And we really like the way it works into your business operation. We're super excited about this webinar. I don't know if I conveyed that enough, because this is a really big step for us. As you'll find out in the first couple of slides of our webinar, we have not, most of the chatbots built on TARS do not have AI in them, and there's a reason for that. But this marks a step in the direction of adding some amount of AI in our chatbots where we feel it is required. And we'll discuss what we mean by all of that in the next couple of slides. Really quickly, before we begin, I want you guys to take a look around. Make sure you know where the chat option is. Make sure you know where the Q&A option is. Make sure you know how to raise your hand, because if you have any questions during the webinar, you should feel free to drop them in any of those places, and we'll be more than happy to answer those questions, because this is a very technical, not a very technical, but it is technical topic. And we understand that you probably have questions. You'll probably have questions along the way. With that, let's get started. The first place where we always begin these webinars is with intros. The older attendees will know exactly what we're talking about in these next slides, because you guys have probably heard it a bunch of times before. Really quick, we will be sending a recording of this webinar after it is done. Let me just make sure really quick that we are recording. We are recording. So really quick, let's get through some intros. We have a lot of new attendees with us today, because again, this is a very exciting topic. I'm Arnav. I'm a content marketer over here at TARS, and that means that I spend most of my time creating content just like this webinar to help other creators, to help other marketers and customer support reps build chatbots to make their businesses more efficient. Vineet, over to you.
Yeah. Yes, so my name is Vineet. I'm the CTO and co-founder of TARS, and so this experiment we are doing, the new launch of the NLP based chatbots, something we have worked with a couple of customers of ours, and we felt confident that it's actually workable in a real world scenario. So we thought we'll actually do a webinar where we can actually showcase some of the things that we have been working with, and help you guys make something similar experience in your own businesses.
Right. As a company as a whole, TARS has been around since around 2016. And actually, Vineet, you're a co-founder. Why don't you give us the intro? Because
sure,
you'll probably do a much better job than I would.
Definitely. So no, not definitely, but yeah, definitely I will have to. So we have been around since 2016 early on, and we have been helping businesses build chatbots for their businesses, primarily with the idea of improving the user experience of giving and interacting with the company, with the business themselves. And the idea that we started out with was that we want to enable businesses to be able to collect information which they were doing through their forms or static forms, especially on mobile devices, which was a very bad experience, because nobody likes to fill out a form, let alone on a mobile device. So we started out with the idea of turning that experience into a more conversational experience, which is around chatbots. And over the years, we have narrowed it down to a very specific use case, which is around improving your conversion rate on your paid campaign or your organic campaign for lead generation purposes. So that is the value proposition that we solve as a company.
Right. And I'd say, just to add to that really quick, we also do a lot of customer support chatbots, because in the course of doing lead generation, a lot of the times to get someone to share their lead information with you, you need to troubleshoot their queries before they're willing to share their details with you. So in the course of making lead gen chatbots, we also end up making a lot of customer support resolution chatbots as well. Now, with those intros out of the way, we can get into the important stuff. This webinar is going to be, as I mentioned before, it's going to be a little more technical than our other webinars. So before we jump in, we thought we'd give you an overview of what we are going to be covering in this session. Now, broadly speaking, we've divided the entire session into 3 parts. The first part is going to be around the theory around NLP chatbots. We think that it's super important that you guys understand what exactly is going on behind the scenes, how exactly the technology works, and how best to deploy it before you actually go out there and try to implement it into your chatbots. Because if you don't have all of those concepts in place, then 1, you won't properly know how to implement it into your stack, and 2, you might implement it in a way that doesn't actually add value to your business. And that's a situation that none of us want. After we're done with the theory section, where we discuss all of those concepts and all of those ideas, we'll talk about how we can take some of those concepts and deploy it into an NLP bot. So we're going to be discussing the broad strokes planning of how we're actually going to go about creating the NLP bot. And then finally, in part 3, we're actually going to act on that plan and show you guys how you can implement an NLP bot to do things for your business.
Yep.
So let's begin with the first part, theory. A good place to start for NLP chatbots is to figure out what we mean by a chatbot. Now, I've said this a lot in these webinars. The traditional definition of a chatbot, which is what you're seeing on your screen right now, a computer program designed to simulate a conversation with a human user to facilitate a trade of information or services. It's a definition that works, but it's far too broad in our opinion. And we find that when people approach chatbots with this definition in mind, they create a chatbot that tries to do too much, and it fails to do any one thing in a sufficient manner. And usually that's a lose-lose situation where the prospect doesn't enjoy the experience, your business suffers because your prospects or your customers are dropping before having their needs met. And that's something we want to avoid. So what we like to do is we like to narrow down our definition of what we mean by a chatbot. And essentially the 2 use cases, as we mentioned in our intro, that we like to narrow chatbots usage down to are capturing leads and resolving customer support queries. Now, I know that a lot of you guys are existing TARS customers, so you already probably know this because we know from looking at our usage data that most of you guys are using chatbots for one of these 2 use cases. Now, in this webinar, we will primarily be focusing on the second one of these use cases, resolving customer support queries. And the reason for that, we'll get into it in the next couple of slides, because to give you guys a sneak peek about what's to come in the next couple of slides. NLP chatbots and NLP in general is geared towards customer support use cases and not so much the lead capture use case. Now, a key distinction that we also have to make when we're thinking about what a chatbot is we need to think about what a chatbot is not. And the distinction that we have to make in this webinar in particular is to tell ourselves consciously that chatbots are not AI. A lot of people in the world of business, a lot of people in the world of digital marketing, customer support reps, think that a chatbot automatically means you have AI. If you implement a chatbot, that means you have AI or you have to implement AI. And that's just not the case. Chatbots can have AI in them, undoubtedly. A lot of chatbots out there do have AI in them. But your chatbots do not need to have AI in them to be a chatbot. And in fact, most of the bots on the TARS builder right now, the vast majority of them don't have any form of AI in them. And before we discuss this further, actually, I think that it's worthwhile for us to explore what we actually mean by AI, because AI is also a very broad set of concepts. But in the context of conversations, when we're talking about AI, we are talking specifically about NLP. That's the term we used in the title of this webinar. And essentially what NLP is when a software takes a piece of text or it takes a piece of speech, so natural language, and it tries to make sense of it. Now, it can try to make sense of it in 2 ways. First, it can try to understand what's there in that text. So we can call that natural language understanding. And 2, it can formulate ways to respond to that piece of text. We can call that natural language generation. In this webinar, we're primarily going to be focusing on the first of these use cases. So how we can make our chatbots understand what the user is saying and then respond to them based on that on on that understanding of what they said. We're not going to be delving into the second part of this because Dialogflow doesn't really do that. But the second part, to give you guys a sense of what we mean by natural language generation, is once you've understood the text that a user has sent you, how are you going to respond to that? And if you use natural language generation technology, NLP technology that generates text, what you can do is you can dynamically create responses to send back to the user.
So
Now with, yep.
just to elaborate on the point about what is AI in general is, so as Arnav has mentioned that AI in general is a huge, much bigger umbrella term, and it can involve any kind of intelligence that is facilitated through some kind of algorithm built on top of a model, which is trained by some kind of data. So you can think of AI in general as, for example, if you want to write a piece of software, you have to write it as a piece of code. You have to actually configure it and you have to write it down to single details of how it is going to work. But in the case of AI, you don't actually have to do that. You actually make a system which can train itself on a piece of basically a data set that you throw at it, and it builds that intelligence automatically. So instead of hiring a software engineer to build your system, you basically hire a data collector, basically who will be feeding in data to that system, and the AI will get more and more smarter. Now, in the context of conversation chatbots, AI basically translates directly to natural language processing, because you're not doing image processing, you're not doing sound analysis, you're not doing audio analysis. You're only focused on and doing the analysis and processing of the natural language, that is the text that is coming from the user over the chat interface. And when it comes to understanding and even basically simulating the human behavior when it comes to texting, basically it boils down to two things. First of all, whatever text you are getting from the end user, you have to understand, you have to make sense of it, and that itself is a huge task if you think about it. Basically, it involves everything that a human is capable of. For example, right now I'm saying something and you are able to understand those words, the word that is coming out of my mouth. Basically, that involves a huge amount of intelligence faculty in terms of your head to understand what I'm saying, and making sure you're comprehending that, you're making sense of it. And then maybe if you're talking to each other one-on-one, you will actually think about and respond to that as well. So that part is about the generation of the natural language generation, and actually coming up with the right response to a particular query or a particular statement that the user is saying. So basically NLP involves two parts, which is understanding what the user is saying, and then creating your own response to that and generating that your response and sending it back to the user for continued conversation. So just coming to the part about, so again, as Anna was mentioned, that in this particular webinar, we are going to only focus on the natural language understanding part of the NLP, which itself is a huge topic, it's itself a huge domain. And even in that, we are going to focus on one specific part of it, because it is going to be, again, as I mentioned, there's a lot of possible ways to understand something, and there's no end to it. It's like human capable intelligence. Even in that, we are going to be focused on one specific part of it, which is going to make sense for the chatbot case. So,
Yep. I mean, to just flesh out what Vineet said a little bit about the like writing your own piece of code versus having a piece of software generate those rules for you. It's like if you have a self-driving car, for example, you can either say if you hit a wall, turn left, or if you come up to a wall, turn left. If you do this, you turn right. Or you can have an AI essentially watch how other human drivers drive and then figure out what those rules are on its own. Now, with this definition in mind, we can think again about what we mentioned before about chatbots not being AI, and sort of flesh out what we were saying a little bit more. So when we're saying a chatbot is not AI and a chatbot does not need AI to be a chatbot, essentially what we're saying is you don't need to have natural language understanding or natural language processing in a chatbot to make it effective. And most chatbots on the TARS builder, as I mentioned before, do not have natural language processing in them, but they still deliver a lot of value. And in fact, we think that in those specific use cases, if the person was to add natural language understanding, it probably wouldn't help in any way. It wouldn't add any value, or in a lot of cases, it might actually diminish the value of the chatbot because you're essentially trying to fit a square block through a circular hole. It's not going to work. It doesn't fit. Now the natural next question is why, where would chatbots work? Would chatbots with AI work, and where would chatbots with AI not work? So we've just established that you want to use chatbots. Chatbots do not require AI to be a chatbot. They make sense in certain use cases and they don't make sense in others. So which use cases do they make sense in? Which use cases do they not make sense in? And the punchline to this argument, we were going to do a bunch of slides to explain, to walk you through the reasoning behind it, but we can just skip right to the punchline. AIs make sense in customer support use cases, and they don't really make sense in lead capture use cases. So if you remember back to the slide where I was talking about what a chatbot is, we divided it up into essentially two types of use cases. And AI chatbots, NLP chatbots, make sense in the second use case, resolving customer support queries. They don't make so much sense in the capturing leads use case. Now, the reason for this is because lead generation is better suited to closed-ended conversations and customer support is better suited for open-ended conversations. Now, I know I'm throwing more jargon at you guys, but this is actually a lot easier to understand than you might think. A closed-ended conversation is essentially when the goal of the conversation is extremely narrow. So if you're thinking about lead generation, for example, the goal of the chatbot in that conversation is very narrow. They're trying to capture the email ID or the phone number of the user. You do care about the other lead information, but at the end of the day, that's really what you care about. The chatbot has one singular goal. It has one specific type of information that it wants to capture, and that's pretty much it. Now, in an open-ended conversation, on the other hand, it's the goal of the conversation is broad. It's the exact opposite. So when you're thinking about customer support queries, I mean, the goal of every single customer support chatbot is to resolve the user's query, but what that user query is going to be completely different in every single use case because people have very unique issues that they're trying to resolve and unique ideas that they need clarification on. Now, because of this initial difference, there are several other differences in the way that closed-ended and open-ended conversations are structured. So in a closed-ended conversation, the chatbot is always in control of the conversation. And essentially what we mean by that is if you think about a lead capture use case for a chatbot, and you think about the sorts of questions that a lead capture chatbot asks, it is dictating the flow of the conversation. It says, oh, great, you want a free quote? I need your email ID, I need your address, I need your name, and I need a little bit more information about your specific situation. Now, the chatbot is dictating what information is being shared in that conversation. And in that sense, the chatbot is in control of the conversation. And related to that, the user input is very structured in that case. So if, for example, you're talking about mortgages, are you buying a new home or are you trying to refinance a home? Those two options are two very specific options that the chatbot is looking for. It can present the user with a set of buttons or a set of cards to elicit that response. Even when you're accepting text response, like in the case of accepting an email or accepting a phone number, that's a very specific structure for the text that you are expecting. And you don't really need AI to understand whether the person has sent you an email or not. If you've taken even one programming class, you'll have the tools that you need to validate whether someone is sending you an email or not. So closed-ended conversations really have a very narrow goal, and because they have a narrow goal, the chatbot is always in control and the user input is structured. It's going after a fixed set of details that can easily be structured in a way that don't really require AI to implement. Now, if you're thinking about a lead generation use case, where would you implement the natural language processing? Would you implement the natural language processing so that instead of just sharing their email with you, they can say, oh, my email is whatever their email is? I don't think that adds much value to the experience. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we were talking about open-ended conversations. In an open-ended conversation, as we mentioned, the goal is broad. Every single customer support query that comes in to your chatbot is completely different from every single other one in the way that it's phrased. They might be going after similar topics. The user controls the direction of the conversation. So think back to how we were thinking through the lead generation chatbot. The lead generation chatbot says, I need your email, I need your address, I need your name. In an open-ended conversation of a customer support chatbot, the reason a customer support chatbot is an open-ended conversation is because it says something like, how can I help you? That is putting the ball in the user's court, and it's giving the user free reign to decide how they can direct the conversation in the next few messages. And related to that, the user input is unstructured. When you ask a question like, how can I help you? The user can type out whatever they want over there. It's not structured in very specific types of information.
So
Beneath,
just to
yep.
just to point out the customer support use case and how it is most suited towards an open-ended conversation. If you have a certain set of, if you see a certain set of questions that is coming up over and over again in your customer support queries, you can even in that case you can think about a closed-ended conversation which can serve a lot of new queries that is coming to you for the customer support. For example, if someone is running a tech support consulting something, and they see that people are always coming up with a query related to setting up their printer or something. Only like 3 or 4 queries are the most common ones. Then in that case, you can potentially make a closed-ended conversation, but there's always a possibility of a users want to ask something new. So open-ended conversation is most open-ended conversations are more suited towards customer support queries, but closed-ended does have a very specific value proposition as well, and which to use when is actually depends on a lot of context, a lot of the business context about exactly what kind of how the user are interacting with your business.
Awesome. So with that, I think you guys have a sense of what exactly we're talking about when we talk about NLP, what exactly we're talking about when we're talking about NLP chatbots, and where you can best use the technology in your where you can best use the technology in your businesses. Now I see that we're getting a lot of questions. I've taken a look at the questions, and I think it's best if we answer these specific questions as we're going along in the slides, because I think some of them will be resolved over the course of the next few slides. Now that we're done with those basic concepts, we can actually jump into the actual planning. So what sort of chatbot are we going to be looking at today? How do the NLP chatbots that you build in TARS work in terms of how they work with other natural language processing engines, particularly Dialogflow? And how can you set all of that up, or how can you conceptually think about how that setup is going to look like? Now, as you probably know from reading through the landing page for this webinar, the two tools that we are going to be using in this webinar are TARS and Dialogflow. TARS is going to be handling the chatbot side of things, so it's going to be handling where you can define the messages of the bot, where you accept the user input query, and Dialogflow is going to handle the natural language processing. It's a software that is owned by Google, and it's an NLP engine. So you can send it pieces of text, and it will try to make sense of that text based on a set of rules that it creates through natural language processing. We'll get into all of that while we are implementing. But the point is, just think about TARS as the chatbot and think about Dialogflow as the NLP brain behind that chatbot. Now, the way that this is going to work is the way that NLP chatbots in TARS work when you're using Dialogflow is that the user sends the chatbot a query. That query is sent by the chatbot to Dialogflow. Dialogflow understands what the user intent is from that message. So it reads that message, it tries to classify it based on a whole set of, based on its natural language processing. And then it sends that, okay, yeah, sorry. It sends that result back to the bot, and then the bot can use that result from Dialogflow to respond to the user based on what they said. So for example, the customer support example that Vineet was talking about, the user sends a customer support query to the TARS chatbot. TARS sends that to Dialogflow. Dialogflow classifies what sort of customer support query that is. Does it fall into, for example, if we're talking about IT support, does it fall into printer issues? Does it fall into projector issues? It sends that back to the TARS chatbot, and then TARS can branch off in different directions based on which sort of intent the user had when they asked their query. Vineet, do you think I missed out anything over there, or?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So if you go to a couple of slides back, the first query that the user is saying, this is the first query that user is actually saying something like, I have problem in my setting up my printer, or my computer is not able to shut down, or some issue that the user is saying, and they are saying it in a completely natural language way. So basically, they are not shown any options or buttons or anything like that. the way it's basically the chatbot is asking the user, okay, well, how can I help you? And user can type in any query, and based on that, whatever user has typed in, it will send the chatbot itself, the TARS chatbot will send that whole query to the Dialogflow, Google Dialogflow model, and this will be sent to a very specific agents, basically within Dialogflow, and we'll come to that part about how to build your models or how to build your agents. So within Dialogflow, we have a concept called agent, where you can build one specific basically entity which will help you train your, which is basically where you can define all the possible user intents that you want to push. Obviously, if you are running an IT support use case, you might have 6 or 7, or maybe broadly some set of intents that you want to resolve, mostly maybe around printer setup or computer shutdown behavior, whatever, right? So once you have those intent in place, you basically will be making some models, and that model will be there on the Dialogflow. Now, this query that your TARS chatbot has captured, it will send that query to the Dialogflow or an API. The Dialogflow will process that. It will classify that query into one of those possible intents, and it will send back. So basically, this is a part where Dialogflow is actually implementing the NLP model of its own, which we have trained early on, and it will send back that result back to the TARS chatbot, and the chatbot can basically, and it will send that intent in a very specific format, and the chatbot will basically make sense of it, and based on that, it can do branching, it can basically respond based on a predetermined flow that you already had in place, and it can branch out and can do more things. So this is the pretty much the flow.
Right. And I noticed that we have a question about whether NLP supports multiple languages over here. As you might have gathered from Vineet talking or from my talking, this general framework is usable for pretty much any language that Dialogflow and TARS supports. We support several languages. Since our chatbots are web-based, whatever language your web browser supports, you can display in the chatbot, I think, right, Vineet?
Yeah.
Yeah. So any language that your web browser supports, our TARS chatbots can support. You might have to check what languages Dialogflow supports and see if the language you're interested in is there in
So
Dialogflow's repertoire.
I think Dialogflow does support pretty good amount of languages. I've seen it. I think it's more than 8 or 10 languages they can support.
Right. And before we move forward, we have a couple of questions about what sorts of algorithms are used by the NLP engines. In terms of what algorithm is used for stemming, I'm not quite sure what algorithm Dialogflow uses. We're just using Dialogflow's software. We don't know what underlying algorithms they are using to create.
So just to elaborate on that quickly, so Dialogflow is a cloud-based NLP AI service, and they are actually ranked as among a lot of different possible NLP providers, like among AWS or Microsoft. They are ranked one of the really good NLP services. I think Microsoft Azure is also one of the good ones in terms of providing NLP and AI services. And these models keep on. They actually make these models a lot more advanced over the time. And basically, the whole point and whole advantage of using these services is that these systems and these ML services actually get updated and get upgraded over the time without us doing research ourselves and implementing those things. So these are really pretty advanced models, pretty state of the art models out there, and it has actually a lot of interesting features, a lot of advanced features that we can use within our system directly.
Yep. So with that, I think we're actually ready to jump into the actual implementation and show you guys what an NLP chatbot looks like, how it's structured, and touch on some key points about how you can build them and how you can train them, which should answer a lot of the questions that you guys are asking in the chat. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen over here and hand it over to Vineet, who is going to walk us through the entire tutorial of how NLP chatbots work.
Sure. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So basically, I want to show you guys how a very quick demo that I prepared for this webinar so that you can see what we are talking about when it comes to NLP and working with NLP in a chatbot setting, right? So this is a very simple chatbot that I made. This is how it looks like. And it basically asks, the very first question is asked is, I am a ask Ubuntu tech support chatbot, and I can help you with tech-related queries. Please let me know what is the query that you want to type. Right? So let's say I'm just typing, I need help with installing my printer. So this is the query I'm typing, and it is going to just tell me what is the intent that the user meant. So basically, as a user, I typed in this query, which is a pretty natural language kind of query. I've not chosen any buttons, or I'm not chosen any input from any from the options, anything that user is given. I just typed in that query, and the chatbot was able to classify this query to one specific intent, which is around setup printer. Now, intent is something I'll come to, and I'll explain what I mean by intent. But basically, the chatbots within this step was able to classify the query that I've given as a user into one of the buckets, which it is able to understand. Similarly, if I type in, if I try again, and if I type in something like need help, or we can say can't shut down my computer. So again, this is another query that I just typed in, and it is again able to find that specific bucket in which it is able to understand this query. So now coming to this intent part, I'll quickly open up my Dialogflow uh, uh, dashboard. So this is the This is a Google Dialogflow dashboard. You can actually go to Google Dialogflow, and you can actually sign up, and this is the place that you will land up. And you can actually, so this is the part, this is actually very similar to if you have used any other NLP service providers. Actually looks a bit similar to that, a lot of other NLP or AI services based software tools, but it's actually quite advanced. So what you can see here already, there's a lot of things that might look a bit confusing, but in this particular webinar, in this particular live build, we are going to only focus on one specific part of it, which is called the intents. Now, intent, a good way to think about user intent or intent in general is we are trying to basically understand what the user is saying in a natural text fashion, and we're trying to classify that input query into one of the buckets that we are able to understand, and based on that, we can actually respond on that as a respond on that particular query. So these buckets or these things, these are basically, we call in the ML, we call it intent, but even basically it's a representative of the user intention. That means what the user is trying to say to you by typing in the query in the natural language fashion, right? So what I've done is here is
so you can think about those intents as, I mean, we'll get into this in a little bit, but you can think about them. For example, the setup printer intent that Vineet just showed you. Someone wants to install their printer drivers, and you need to decide which messaging you're going to show them. They type out their query, you figure out through Dialogflow that their intent is setup printer, and now you can branch your TARS chatbot to go into the printer setup flow of your conversation, where you explain how you can set up a printer, instead of going into the shutdown computer flow where you tell people how they can shut down their computer.
Yes, so you can think of it like a button option. So intent, you can think of it as actually like a button option that you want to give to the user in the beginning of the conversation. But instead of giving as a button option, you are allowing users to be able to type in their query in their own way. This is actually a good way to try to engage the user, because user can type in anything and get a response back. Essentially what you are trying to do is you are trying to classify the user's query into one of these buckets, right? So coming to the intent and coming to the Google Dialogflow, basically the way to begin with. So here you can see already I have created one agent called the Ask Ubuntu Tech Support Agent. So I can quickly show you what is the setting for this particular agent. So I've given this name for this agent, and I've said the time zone. I've said the the languages and all that. So this is something you can actually do by going here and creating a new agent yourself. So this is actually the way to, you can actually give a name to it. You can set up the language that you're asking for. So basically, these are the language that is supported by the Google Dialogflow system itself. You can set your time zone here, and you can then create a new Google project. This is something you want to select here, because there's going to be separate keys that needs to be uh, generated. For you have to select a key to create a new Google project. So I'll not create a new agent here. I will basically go back to my own agent here. So I'll just go here, and I'll go to intent section of that. So as you can already see, I've already set up some intents here, because setting up that whole thing from scratch will take a lot of time, and we won't have that much time in this webinar. So I already set up a few intents in this. And before I jump into it, we have to talk about how you're going to train your intent. So basically, once you have identified which intents you want to put as part of your agent, you have to basically bring in, you have to have a data set on which you want to train your intent as well. So if I open this particular intent, which is setup printer, you will be able to see the training phrases that I have actually added for this intent, which is going to train the model that is used by Dialogflow in order to identify any new user query that is coming on the chatbot, or basically any new user that is coming on the Google Dialogflow. So what I've done is basically I have actually got this data set from GitHub. This is actually pretty good Ask Ubuntu corpus data set. Basically, these are the queries that's asked by users on the Ask Ubuntu forum. So for people who don't know, Ubuntu is like an operating system similar to Windows or Mac, and basically these queries coming from the forum. They're collected from the forum that is there on the web. So
it's actually the operating system that Vineet is using. So the interface that
yes.
you're seeing right now, that's Ubuntu.
Yes, this is the Ubuntu as well. And if I remove this filter from here, so as you can see, this is these are the queries. These are the queries that users have. This is the part of the data set. There are 162 queries here, user phrases, and each of these queries has a particular intent associated with that. So you can think of this intent as the label or the ground truth of what this query actually means. So these are the queries related to software recommendation. So, for example, what is the best mind mapping software or software to read QR code? So these are the queries that people have asked on that forum, and somebody has manually labeled this query with this intent. Similarly, if I scroll down, you can see here, how do I shut down without the confirmation prompt, or no action when shutdown pressed. So these are the queries related to shutdown computer intent. Similarly, there are queries around how to partial update Ubuntu 11.1 to 11.04. So these are like updation related queries. How do I update from one version of operating system to another version, right? So these are the data set that is I've actually got, and it's pretty good data set actually for this particular demonstration. So if I filter this intent block here, I can show you, you can see basically there are 5 intents here. One is around make it updates, and there is set up printer, shut down computer, software recommendation, and then there's miscellaneous queries as well, miscellaneous intent as well. So if I have to pick related to shut down printer, I can see the queries here, right? So similar, basically based on these intents, I have created intents bucket here. And for demonstration purpose, I've actually created the 4th intent only here. And I'm going to add one more intent called miscellaneous, and I'll show you how to do that. So if I go to miscellaneous, so you can see there's a very few amount of queries here corresponding to this. So I'll just pick this. So it's creating intent is very simple here. Just click on create intent button here. They'll ask you for the intent name. So I'll just put this, save this. So the intent has been actually created. Now, once the intent has been created, you will see a block here which is called training phrases, and this is the place you actually put in the training phrases that you have. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy these and just put it simply one after another. So these are the training phases for this particular intent. So these are miscellaneous queries. So I'm just any queries that comes which is similar to this will fall into this particular intent, which is a miscellaneous intent, and any other query which is already there related to some other intent will actually go there. So once I've added these training phases here, I just have to click on the save. And Google Dialogflow takes care of everything else in terms of building this model, saving the data, everything. So basically right now, if I go back to intents, you will be able to see this new intent has come, and it has the corresponding training phrases as well. So I'll do one thing. I'll actually open one of these other intent here. This is the setup printer intent. And I've already added around 20 phrases from this data set. I've not added all of them, but I can actually easily add most of from this training phase. So basically the idea here is you can actually add as many training phases here as possible, because that will make the model more accurate. So even if somebody is saying something even remotely related to printer, the model will be able to identify, okay, this is related to setup printer intent. So idea is if you add more real data, like the actual user queries that the people are asking, that the more your model will become more accurate and more precise. And we'll come and talk about how to think about making this data set, and how to have a uh, how to have a data set which is actually solves and actually makes the model more precise. So we'll actually talk a bit deeply about that as well. But this is actually how we do it. So right now I've shown you the way to add these training phrases in a manual fashion, but this can also be added in a more automated and mass way as well.
So really quick to build on what Vineet was saying, essentially what Dialogflow is doing over here is it's looking at these phrases, it's trying to figure out certain patterns in them automatically to figure out what sorts of phrases go under the setup printer intent. And then when a user sends a query and we send that query to Dialogflow, it's going to try and figure out which patterns it fits best. Does it fit the patterns in setup printer best? Does it fit the patterns in miscellaneous best? Does it fit the patterns in shutdown computer best? And then based on that, decide which intent that query matches with the most.
Exactly. So you can think of it, so in machine learning, this process is called classification or data classification problem, where you train the model, the machine learning model, based on predefined predefined data set of labeled data, which in this case, this is the data, this is the raw data that you have, and these are the labels corresponding to each of those raw data. So you basically give the model this data set, which is already a labeled data set, and it makes a model behind the scenes which is capable of understanding any new user phrase that you throw at it. So if I based on this understanding, it creates this based on these data set, the model creates an understanding about and basically finds some patterns about what kind of words come before printer, or what kind of words come before even obscure things like canon and all those things. It figures out that model and puts that into one chunk. And when you throw a new user conversation or new phrase on it basically try to classify that with a certain amount of confidence level. So that is how the Google Dialogflow intent detection mechanism works. There's a few more things that Google Dialogflow is capable of, especially things like entity detection, which is quite useful when you are trying to understand some of the things that user has quoted inside the text. For example, in this case, user is quoting Ubuntu 15.04, and there's an entity defined which is around detection of the version of the OS. So this is not defined in this particular agent because I have not defined it, but it is able to highlight this based on it is a number. So it is able to identify this is a number entity. So this is something we will not get into in this particular webinar. We are only going to focus on the intent detection part of it. So this is the model. This is the way to set up intent. Just to quickly overview, if you want to generate this kind of model, you have to just first of all sign up on the Google Dialogflow, create a new agent. For that, you just have to give a name, language, and your time zone. Once you create your agent, you will come to your intent section. You can create an intent by clicking on create intent here, give a name to that intent, and then once you've given the name, you can actually add the training phrases on which you want to train it. And these can be basically training data set. These data set can come from live chat, or it can come from your email data set. It can come from a lot of places. You can also generate those by thinking about what kind of queries people will actually ask. Right. So once you have this, now you have a model through on which you can actually interact from your chatbot. So I'll quickly jump to the chatbot that I have made, and I'll show you what exactly this is doing. So this is a very simple demo chatbot I made for this webinar. In the very first gambit, I'm just asking the user for their query. This is a normal text input, custom text kind of input UI, and user just gives their input. Basically, they ask their query immediately here. Now, after they give their input, this particular gambit is actually doing a kind of authentication or interacting with the Dialogflow API. Now, this is a pretty mechanical stuff. It actually uses OAuth-based authentication, and we decided not go into too much into it because it will take a lot more time. But basically, it's a very mechanical process, and somebody who has done API integration, they know how to basically work with that. If you need any help with this thing, you can always reach out to us, and we can set this thing up pretty quickly for you. So this is basically generates this basically generates a authentication token which can be used by our system. So basically, it generates a access token which is available for some time. You can see it is available for 3600 seconds, and then it can be used by the actual API call that we are going to make in this gambit. So
Really
here,
quick, before we move forward, what we can actually do is when we're sending out the recording of this webinar, we can create a tutorial on how to set up the refresh access token gambit, and we'll add it in the top right corner. That way you guys will know how to do that when coming into.
yes, definitely. So once we have generated the access token, which gets refreshed every few hours, actually every 1 hour, and this is actually a very secure way to uh, access your Google Dialogflow API. What you can do is you can actually so right now I'm referencing that access token that is being generated in the previous gambit. But if I replace that here and I can change, so that basically it is able to make that API call. And if I change this to need, so this is the place where I'm actually referencing the user response on the gambit called user utterance. So that is the reference, the data referencing. People who already know, they will know how to do that. But I'm going to just change that to actual query. I can't install my printer, and if I make a call here, so it actually got the response back from Google Dialogflow, and as you can see, this is the intent value, and this is the display name, and this is the value that I got. This is the setup underscore printer, and this is exactly the same which I got here, right? This is the intent that I actually wanted it to match. Along with this, you can also see this value here. I don't know if you can see, but there's a value here called zero. It's called intent detection confidence, and the value here is 0.8378. Like this is basically, you can think of it like how much basically the Google Dialogflow model is telling us how much confident it is that this particular user query that it has seen actually belongs to this particular intent bucket. In this case, it is 83.7% sure that it actually belongs to that particular bucket, which is pretty good classification, given that you have not that many intent in your system. So if you have only 5 or 6 intent, that's actually pretty good conversation confidence level, right? And so after this, I'm just adding this value, adding this display name value here. So let me quickly add this reference to this confidence level as well, which is right at the intent level. So this will be confidence. So this is actually from a scale of 0 to 1. So that's why it is 0.83. And if I just bold this, it's what, but actually, 1 second. So since I've changed the references, I don't want to override them. So I just, let me add this here like now and save this. So once it got once it has gotten the user intent, detected the user intent, I'm just getting that API reference and I'm just showing it here in this message bubble. And this is exactly what this chatbot is doing. So I just publish this chatbot and refresh. Now if I type need help with printer installation, so it is able to find the it is able to identify the intent, and it is also telling me the confidence level as well. So once you got these two values, so in this particular demo chatbot, I'm just connecting back to another user entrance capture gambit, so I can just try it again and say it something else. But once you got the intent, and once you got the reference of that intent, and you know that this will only be one of these possible five intents, one of these possible five intents that is there. Apart from this, Google Dialogflow actually gives you two more default intents. These are called welcome and welcome intent and fallback intent. And I'll quickly show you what that means. So if I say hi, very simple hi message to this chatbot, it actually connects to a default welcome intent with the contents of one. These are the out of the box intent that is there. And if I actually give some random text which is not trained on, and something which is not uh, understandable by the Google Flow, it actually gives a default fallback intent. So you can think of it like a default fallback. Basically, if the Google Dialogflow model is not able to understand something, it will give you this particular intent. So once you got the intent and you know that this intent belongs to either one of these five intents or one of these two default intents, you can do a lot of things. You can actually then use that property to do conditional based jumping, conditional jump. You can actually show the value to the user, or you can actually have different flows for resolving some different queries. So for example, in this case, if you want to add compare this display name, this intent name, you can actually add a conditional jump value. And we have a webinar again about that as well, about how to use conditional jump, where you can set the reference of the value that you're getting from the Google Dialogflow API and then compare it against one of these setup printer or any of these intent. So if this value is equal to setup printer, basically the gambit will go to that particular flow. Otherwise, it will go to some other flow. So you can actually do something called intent-based branching uh, based on the intent that you got in from the Google Dialogflow model. Anand, do you have any questions around that?
Sorry, what was that?
So basically, yeah, this is actually what I wanted to explain. I just wanted to ask you this: does it make sense? Like, I think you'll be able to ask any questions if you have any.
About the conditional jumping?
No, not that, but basically how we are doing the intent detection.
Right. So we actually have a question over here from one of the users. What happens if a phrase belongs to multiple intents?
So this is the classical classification problem. So basically, the Google Dialogflow model will always give you only one intent for any given live detection. So basically, any phrase that you throw at it, it will only give you one intent, and it will give you the contents of that particular intent. It will never give you two intents at the same time. So as you can see in this specific in this specific API response that we got, there was only one specific intent value. It's not a there's no possible way for it to give multiple values. Basically, the model is defined and the model is created in a way it will only give you one specific intent detection. So it's like you're bucketing things in any input data into one specific bucket, and for that classification on that bucket, it will give you the contents that it has. This contents might be very low; it can be 0.1 or 0.2. In that case, you might want to even check. You can actually do a check on that contents level in the conditional jump to do something more about it. But I won't go that far, because any intent that is coming from the Google Dialogflow, I'll just assume that it's correct or it's good enough. So yeah, it will actually classify to one intent only. It will not classify to multiple intents.
So actually, Vineet, I was wondering, I'm sure this is a question that a lot of people have, but you mentioned the default fallback intents.
Yeah.
If a user query doesn't fit into one of these preset intents that we have over here, how do you recommend that bot creators handle that in the chatbot?
Yeah, so if you so there's a very inbuilt feature in the Go Dialogflow where if the model by the Go Dialogflow does not understand any input query, it will put that into a fallback intent, and it will come back as it'll actually the intent name will come back as it is default fallback intent. In fact, I think you can maybe change the name of it, but it will come as that. And what you can do in your chatbot is you can actually look for that value. If the intent name is default fallback intent, you can actually make a separate branch in your conditional jump and connect it to a gambit, which is capturing the user's query, or maybe connecting, or maybe asking them for their email so that somebody can reach out to them, or maybe creating a customer support ticket on your ticket support system, right? So it can do a bunch of other things that are possible. That basically at that point, your chatbot is not able to understand what the user is saying and not able to classify to a particular flow. So at that point, either you can give it to the user that they can connect to a person directly, or you can put them into a flow where they can select based on the close and based on the option based selection that is already there.
Do you think it might be possible to see an example of how you might add that condition, that jumping over here?
So basically for that, I have to set up that conditional jump, and that might take some time. So basically the way it will basically work is, if you set this, let me set this up in here quickly. So this is actually, even in our case, if you see the condition jump, we already have a thing called default branch. So if you're adding conditions, or if you're adding branches for matching different branches, different intents that you have in your Google Dialogflow model. So let's say in our case, we have 5 intents. So we can actually make a case. We can actually take this, and so this is the reference to the intent that is coming from the API. And I'll just put it in all of these 5 and then I'll just pick these 5 intents that I have, and basically put them here in each 5 places. Basically, you basically allocate and set those five intents and match those values. If the intent is matching to one of those values, it will go to that branch. So basically, if it matching to the first one, it will go to the first branch, and if it matching to, let's say, the printer one, it will actually go to that branch. But if it doesn't match any of those conditions, doesn't matter what the value of that intent is, it will, but by default it will go to that default branch. This is the last one. So as you can see here, I have created 5 branches, which is correspond to 5 different intents, and then you have a default branch. And these are the 6 sockets that you got at the end of it. So what you can do is basically you can have different gambits here, which connects to these 6 different flows that are possible within the chatbot. So you can actually connect it. So this particular chat gambit will solve the query related to software recommendation. This might solve the query related to printer installation. This might solve the query related to shutdown behavior. And then you have a default, the last one, the default branch, which connects to this gambit, which can basically do the things that I was talking about, what to do in the case when you're not able to understand what the user is trying to say. So that is the way to do it, I guess.
Thanks.
Do you have?
All right. So I think the natural next question, this is all super neat. We now know exactly how the TARS chatbot communicates with Dialogflow and what happens in Dialogflow to classify what happens in broad strokes to classify the piece of text that the user has sent into one of these user intent buckets. And then based on that classification, you can send them in different branches with custom messaging flows in them, which is what you just showed us with this conditional jumping. Now, the natural, yep, go for it.
Just to point on that, you can actually do this kind of intent direction anywhere in the conversation. So it doesn't have to be the very first text that is user typing in. Within even the further branches that you want to do, you can also do another place where you want to do this call to the Google Dialogflow and make another call to detect intent based on the user query. So those are always possible.
Right. So I think the natural next question that a lot of people have, and we've seen it come up in the Q&A quite a bit over here, is how do you set up? First of all, how do you decide what intents you're going to include? And second of all, how do you generate the training data set
Yeah.
that you feed into the intents.
Yeah, this is actually really good. I mean, this is actually as you said, is actually a very natural question to think about. And the way, so I've been thinking about how to figure out, or even how to think about intent in general as well. So you can think of user intent as user wishes or user intentions. As a So when you are building a software system or building an AI system, essentially you are trying to build a servant which is capable of serving anything to the user, right? And because it's a servant, it can serve anything. Potentially it can serve anything. User will ask it, and it will wish for some kind of thing to be resolved, right? So what this by user intent, what this means is you have to classify the intention of the user based on what kind of things you can fulfill as an organization. So for example, in this case, this is a tech support chatbot, and in this particular data set, we are talking about only 5 specific intention that needs to be fulfilled. But actually, it comes down to uh, what kind of services and what kind of information as an organization you are capable of delivering. Because if you are running a car insurance company, and if a user comes in and says, "I want a double cheese pizza," you won't be able to solve that. So there's no point making an intent which caters to that particular intent by the user, right? You will only be focused on intent which is relevant to your business, relevant to your organization, and relevant to the things that you are capable of serving, either as a service or as an information. So thinking about these intents is actually not an easy task. Basically, you have to completely wrap your head around about what your organization stands for and what your organization is capable of fulfilling and capable of servicing. And that can be very difficult thing sometimes, because the information aspect of thinking about what intent your organization is capable of delivering, that itself can be difficult. So a good way to think about is just focus on the very core intent of the core services of your organization. Like if you're running a car insurance company, think about, okay, the user will come and they want either a car insurance, or they will want information about how to get it, or a few more things, right? So basically understanding those things about what your organization or your business is capable of serving, and then basically going back, starting from that, and then going back from there to what kind of queries users ask in general, to match to or to map to that service that your organization is capable of fulfilling. So it's a very good framework to think about. Okay, you start with the things that you are capable of defining, and then go back and think about the user intents that is going to make sense, that is going to be relevant to those services that your organization is capable of serving, and all the rest is just default intent. That all the rest you can just ignore, and all the rest you can just put them into one bucket.
Right. I think that maybe a good way about going about doing that, like you just mentioned, think about the capabilities that your company has to deal with. You can either think about the sorts of products that you send, so like what sorts of categories you have, what sorts of services, what sorts of products you guys send. Or if you're doing it particularly in the context of customer support, you probably already get customer support queries from your users from either live chat or from through your email or on phone calls or on text message. If you can gather all of that data in one place, you can easily set up the Google sheet that Vineet just showed us, where you actually collect that data and then you like assign it a specific intent category. The reason I'm suggesting you guys do this is because we found when we're working with most of our customers who do use customer support chatbots, they have a good sense of the 5 or 6 most important customer support query categories that people ask queries in, and generally those 5 intent buckets cover 90, or not 90 maybe, but at least 70% of all the queries that are coming in. So if you can identify those 5 key areas that people ask a lot of questions in, you can use those as your intent buckets.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, basically training your data set based on the live chat conversations, email conversations, basically any past customer support conversation that you have, and putting them together. That's actually a good place to start as well.
And actually, really quick, you can actually also use a chatbot to generate that data for you. So the way you can think about it is you can create a closed-ended dumb chatbot, if you will, with no AI in it, which just says, what's your query? What's your email? I'll connect you with a human user. Put that on your website for a couple of months. Put that on your website for a couple of weeks, however long you want to generate data for. And then you can go into the TARS builder, export that data into a CSV, and structure it in the way that we've done over here, and then use that to train your Dialogflow agent.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I think with that, we're pretty much done with the live build or the live demo section of this webinar. We'll move over to the answering of questions. You guys do have a lot of questions, so we can jump into that. Vineet, actually, do you want to take over the screen recording again and just have the Dialogflow and TARS open? That way, if people have questions about the specific implementation, we can show it to them on the spot.
Sure.
Okay, so the first question we have from Sam Benny is there a way we can extract input from an image other than text? So in the specific case of Dialogflow just deals in natural language processing. So you do have to send them information in the form of text, I believe, right, Vineet? I don't think you can send them an image and then have Dialogflow figure out what text is in that image.
Yeah, for that, so if you want to extract some information from an image or something fancy like that, you can use some other API, basically, essentially, not the Google Dialogflow API, but some other API which does exactly that. So it can actually take the image as an input and it can give you either a text or whatever you want from that out of that image. So you just have to find that API and you can connect it just like how you connected the Dialogflow API with your TARS chatbot.
Right. The next question we have is from Elizabeth. Are payment gateway integrations fully supported while building the intent? For example, the general process of integrating the merchant key and access key for Indian payment gateways. And then there are payment gateways like Stripe or PayPal, which will only require the email ID or not of the authorized ID. Did the flow work seamlessly in those integrations are done with attributes or points should be captured to achieve it on this NLP? I think if you're looking to authorize your payment gateway in the TARS builder, I think you just need to do a simple API integration with probably OAuth.
Yeah.
I think that's what you're saying over here. And that can be done in the same way that we did the refresh access token gambit over here. And we'll add a video on how we set that up in the recording of this. So Vineet, do you want to open up the refresh access token gambit just to show how you can send those details?
So this specific gambit uses OAuth-based authentication mechanism, which is used by Google Dialogflow APIs. But in the case of payment integration, I think a lot of payment gateway require another set of security, which is related to encryption, which is just another API call and uses encryption keys that needs to be have to be saved in a secure place. So but at the end of the day, it's actually just another API call. Which has encrypted data inside it, right? So even if you have use cases around payment integration, which is connected to NLP and either connected to NLP or not, all of those things are possible in the chatbot. And if you need any help with integration with that, you can just always reach out to us, and we can help you with that.
And I think we're also building we do have an intent on building a native integration for payment gateways in the TARS builder.
Yes,
it's in the pipeline.
So that is already on the roadmap.
Yeah.
Just to point out on that, so this whole capability that we have demonstrated today mostly revolves around connecting to the Google Dialogflow API, and there is a bit of a technical know-how that you can see that's needed. Like in this particular case, you have to set this thing up, which is not very easy for people to do pretty easy quickly, right? So we do have plans in the roadmap where we can make this process even simpler, where all this training that you have to do through Google Dialogflow can be done from within the TARS chatbot builder directly. So that is something we have it in our product roadmap, which will make this process a lot easier, especially for non-technical people. But this is something that we have in the roadmap. But those things are definitely possible, and we intend to actually make something around the lines.
Now we have a great question over here from Stuti. She says the creation of the knowledge base is the actual work, right? Is there any AI that's really used, any learning that's happening through the AI? Now that's a great question. You're right in that most of the work that's happening from your end is you're creating that knowledge base for Dialogflow to train on, but there is actually some classification happening on the back end. So over here, Vineet, do you think you could open up the Dialogflow tab and open up one of the intents? So over here in the make update intent, you have put in a lot of work to, first of all, source all of these training phrases and input them into this intent. But Dialogflow is actually doing work behind the scenes of figuring out patterns within these training phrases to identify when a new phrase might fit this intent. So essentially how you can think about it is you might spend a lot of time generating 500, 1,000 different training phrases for a particular intent, and it will take time to generate those phrases, and that is where a lot of your work and a lot of your effort is going in. But now when a user sends a completely new phrase, so phrase number 1001 or phrase number 1050, Dialogflow doesn't need you to tell it what intent to put that phrase into. It is going to look at the training data that it has and cross-reference that it's going to cross-reference that new phrase with its model to classify it in one of these intent buckets. So that's where the AI comes into play. Dialogflow is taking all of that data that you're spending so much time creating, and it's creating a model around that data to figure out how any new data can be classified into any one of these intent buckets. I hope that answers your question. The next question we have is, my use case is the Dialogflow gives back the response based on my API, and I fetch the response to give it back to the user. For example, the user says, tell me the price of iPhone XR. The intent is price. API response given, that's the API response given by Dialogflow. Mm-hmm. Now you need to use that response to give it to the user. How can you do that? So that actually gets back into the conditional jumping that Vineet was talking about. So Vineet, do you think you could jump back into the TARS builder and jump into the conditional jump gambit? Mm-hmm. So over here, essentially what we're doing is if you scroll back up to the API response call. So over here, we are sending an API call to the user, to Dialogflow. We're sending the user's utterance to Dialogflow. Dialogflow sends back an intent that it is classified that utterance into. And now what Dialogflow is what you can do in the TARS builder with that information that Dialogflow has sent back to you is you can branch off the conversation in different directions and give customized flows based on which intent the user was classified into. So that's what we're doing over here in the conditional jump section. We are looking at the API response, that whole complex looking data referencing statement we have over there, pre.detect intent.query result. What that is doing is it is checking what the intent the Dialogflow sent back is. It's checking in the first branch, for example, is that intent software recommendation? If it is software recommendation, let's go in the direction of branch 1. And then in branch 1, you can define a custom set of messages based on that user intent. If it goes into branch 2, if it identifies that the intent is make update, you can send them into branch 2 and show them a customized set of messages based on that particular user intent. So that's where you are really leveraging Dialogflow's classification to deliver customized messaging flows. So the way you can think about it is if you want to direct people in the context of customer support to specific resources in your knowledge bank relating to these buckets, once you detect their intent, you can redirect them to specific chatbots or specific help docs that you have that address that particular intent area. And that makes it easier for the user to figure out where they can go to find the information that they need, or you could just answer it on the spot, which is what some people do in the chat.
There is, I think, in that question, there is one more feature within Dialogflow, which we have not touched upon, which actually comes out of Dialogflow, where you can define the text response once you have identified an intent, and you can define these text response here. I think the person who has asked the question probably refers to this thing. So text response is something you can define once the Dialogflow is able to identify the intent, it will throw one of the text in the response that is coming here. So if I just type in some text response here, it will actually randomly pick one of these text responses, and it will send back to me as the API response in this particular API call. So along with the intent that it has detected, it will also give me one of the text response that you have set. If you have not set anything, it will be empty. But you have set it, it will just pick one of those. So this will also come as part of that packet, as part of the API response. And the only thing, if you want to reference that and you want to show it back to the user, you just have to find the reference for that particular data, similar to how we have done it in this way with the dot notation, and you can actually show that back to the user if you want.
All right, moving on to the next question. How does QR embedding work in the flow? This is just a matter of taking a QR code image that you have and dropping it into the messaging flow. Our platform supports embedding images into your flows. Vinit's showing you how you can do it right now. Next to the message bubble, if you click on the plus option and then you click on the camera icon, it lets you input an image, and you can either upload it or you can put an image URL to the QR code that you want. Now, this is a question related to Dialogflow. Is there any limit on the intents that you can put into Dialogflow? That's a great question. Vinit, do you want to take a stab at it?
I don't think so. I think I'm pretty sure there must be some limit. They cannot be unlimited, but I think they do allow a lot of things. I think they do have a plan that they have standard edition, they have enterprise edition, and intent is not one of the criteria for that plan. So I think you can unlimited users action, unlimited quotas for this. I have to check on that. I mean, probably you can find it in the Google documentation as well. But I think there's no whatever limits that they have set. It should be good enough. I think for any real use cases. So I think I don't think that's going to be a problem if you want to really capture a lot of intent in your model.
A related question: are there any limitations on the training phrases? I don't think there is. The more training phrases you have, the better. Obviously, I mean, obviously, you don't want to overfit your data, which is when you have training phrases that are too specific to just your training set. But there is no limit on the training phrases. Dialogflow is used by a lot of enterprises in their customer support operations, and as you can imagine, like big enterprises get a lot of queries every single day. They get in the order of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions in some cases, I'm sure. So there is definitely no limit on the number of training phrases you can add into your Dialogflow model. Now,
I would actually go and look at this at that as well. But I think for all practical purposes, they must have kept a limit, which the model can handle, I guess.
Is there a number of how many phrases Dialogflow needs for each intent bucket to be capable? This is a great question, Vineet. We should definitely answer this. So the question is there a number of phrases that Dialogflow needs? So is there a minimum number of phrases that Dialogflow needs in each intent bucket to be able to learn how to classify things into that bucket? That's a great question. Vineet, go ahead.
That number is 1. So you actually need just one training phrase. I think if you keep it empty, it will probably conflict with the default fallback intent. So at least you need to have one training phrase. But obviously, with one training phrase, the model will be pretty. It won't work it won't work really well at all. Like it will basically have conflicts, and the confidence level will be pretty low as well. So there is no limit. There is no lower limit to it. The only lower limit is you have to at least have one training phrase. But obviously you want to put as much training phrase as you want in order to make the accuracy better. One good way to think about when you're thinking about training phrases is, even if you do not have like right now, if you're making a new agent, if you want to try it right after this webinar, if you want to try out and make an agent, make some intents, one thing you can do very quickly is you don't need any training set. You can actually think about your use cases, and you can actually think about what kind of queries usually people ask and just type that in. Like for example, if I have a printer setup intent, my printer is not working. please help. So this is a very common thing. If my print is not working, I'll probably write it like this, right? So I can just type in some of the queries, some of the ways that I think people usually ask questions, or some of the ways I would ask that question. I can just put in directly in. So that's a very simple and very frugal way to start building your training phrases, start building your model for each of your intent. But obviously, the more data and the more accurate data that you actually train it on, the better the model is.
Right. Now, the next question we have is, can you touch on sub-agents and how they can help users in very specific contexts after the initial interactions?
Sub agents, I think you're talking about mega agents, I guess, right? So there is a concept called mega agents, and I can show you here. Actually, when you create a new agent, that's where it comes.
And actually, Vineet, another question we have, we're getting quite a few questions about how you can hook up the TARS API. Since we're in the Q&A section, people, by the way, people, you can leave if you want. We'll send you the recording of this. Do you think we can, if we're creating a new agent here, maybe just quickly show them how they can find the keys that they need?
Find
for
what?
the OAuth. Actually, no, never mind. We'll, you know what? To the people who are asking about the API integration to TARS, when we're sending out this recording, we'll send you a short clip on how we set that up as well.
Yeah, so the question about the sub agent is that I think in the context of mega agent, we have this thing, which is you can think of a mega agent as like a combination of multiple agents that work together. So if you have a really elaborate use case in your mind, for example, if you want to make one chatbot which is going to represent your whole organization, your whole business, your whole company, you can make agents for different department about on your company and connect them together into one mega agent, basically, which will route the initial query to at the beginning to one. The mega agent can have up to 10 sub agents. So you can actually connect to one of the agents, and then within that agent, it will try to detect the intent and try to match it with the right intention the user is having. So definitely something you can actually explore. There's a Google Dialogflow has a really great documentation. You can actually go to cloud.google.com and slash Google Dialogflow slash docs, and you can actually, this is a great place to start, which is how you can set this thing up. You can build an agent. You can even do more things. So definitely something worth looking into. And any point, any service that the Google Dialogflow allows, it also exposes the API corresponding to that. So that means you can always connect that particular service to your TARS chatbot and bring that in your TARS chatbot experience. I hope that answers your question.
The next question we have is, can I use training phrases from other agents? Are there training phrases? Can we use training phrases from other agents in a particular Dialogflow agent?
Other agents, as in like you are the one who created the agent or somebody else? I think the question is probably if somebody else has created the agent, right? So this Google Dialogflow actually has these things called pre-built agents. So these are agents that obviously it's pre-built agents that Google Dialogflow actually ships along, and you can see some of the use cases are pretty nice. So if I see there's a flight related agent which has these kind of conversations, like find a flight from this to this, from one location to another location of this, right? So actually it has, if I import this particular agent into the system, it will actually allow you to, it can actually show, you can actually see some things what is going on. Let me add this. So it will actually show you the intent that is already classified for that particular use case, which is in this case is flight reservations and FAQs. And there is a way to export the training phases or export that agent's information into a zip file, and then you can import it the same. So you can see here they have defined a lot of intents here: flight luggage missing, flight special request. And if I go to one of these intents, I can actually see the training phases as well. So you can see the training phases not that much. For this one, this is actually just 8 or 9 training phases. But it's actually a good place as well to start for you as well if you want to understand what kind of agent you want to build. Actually, this is actually a good place if you are building something which is closely related to the pre-built agent that comes along with Google Dialogflow. And there is an option to export things as well. I can show you here.
So we have a clarification from Lokesh who asked the question. He says that he has actually created multiple agents.
Yes. Yeah. So basically, that's we can actually you can find a way to connect them together. Coming to this about the import export, you can actually export the whole agent as a zip file, and once you export it, I think you'll just download that as a zip file, and then you can create your own intent. And when you are importing it, I guess it actually asks you whether you want to keep the existing intent and merge the new intents along with that, or do you want to override it? So I think in your case, you might want to merge them together. So that is something you can use if you're thinking about building something from a pre-built agent rather than starting from scratch.
All right, so we have, I think, 2 more questions, and then we can close out this session. How do you take the user back to a flow after giving a text response for an intent? So that'll actually happen in the TARS builder. As you can see in the TARS builder, we structure our conversations as a flow chart. So once you've delivered the messaging, so for example, in GID 6 or GID 7, or GID 9, once you have delivered the flow, once you've delivered the messaging flow based on the intent, you can give the user options on how they can proceed the conversation, to either ask another query, to say that their query was resolved, and then based on that input, take them back in the flow or take them to a new flow. That happens in the TARS builder, and that happens based on how the user responds to the messaging that you send them. Now, theoretically, what you could do is after you tell them about how they can, for example, set up their printer, you can give them another open text response input, so using text input and custom text, and then you can send that to Dialogflow again to a different agent or the same agent with a different intent.
You can actually connect this back to user utterance like this. I mean, not here, but maybe after this conversation flow ends, you can actually bring them back, and this will say, sure, please type in the calculate query again, and it will go back. So basically, you have set up a loop here. It will actually go back to generating the token and detecting the intent, and it will go back to intent-based branching.
And then the final question that we have is, since Dialogflow already supports multiple languages while reading an intent in English, any given language in this case, would the response be automatically processed and have smart replies or AI driven for other languages as well for that specific requirement? Or do you need to create separate intents in multiple languages for the same use case? I think as of right now, you probably need to, I don't think Dialogflow is going to translate your English training phrases on the fly and deliver responses to non-English responses based on your English training set. You will need to replicate that in the language that you want to train it in, and if Dialogflow supports that language, then it will process the user input that you feed it based on those additional translated phrases that you input into the intents. Would that be a fair assumption, Beneath? Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to create a different agent. Basically, these agents, you have to create that agent with that language in mind. So everything will be specific to that language. So even your intent, probably you can name intent names whatever you want, but the training phrases will be in that language. So for example, if you use German as the language of your agent, these phrases has to be in German language. If you put in English language, it might completely fail altogether.
Right. All right, guys. And with that, I think we're going to close out the session. We've kept you guys here for long enough. Thank you guys for joining us. We love doing webinars like this. We know that it's valuable for you guys because you guys can see how the builder is used and what sorts of awesome stuff you can do with it. We're going to be hosting more webinars next week. And the week after, we're going big on webinars. So keep a lookout for that stuff. As I mentioned at the beginning of this recording, we will be sending out a recording of this webinar after we process it, after we create that clip for you guys where we explain how we can set up the OAuth for API integration for the Dialogflow integration, and then we'll send it out to you guys through an email. Keep an eye out on our newsletter. That's generally where we send it, or just go to our website and go to the webinars section. We post all our recordings over there. In fact, let me just share my screen with you guys right now so that I can show you guys what that looks like. If you go to the TARS website and you go to resources, under resources, you can select webinars, and under webinars, we have links to all of our previous webinars with all of the recordings in them. And we will add the Dialogflow webinar over here as well, so you can take a look at all of the webinars that we have. Thank you guys for joining us. It's been a pleasure hosting this session for you guys.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.